some of the vitamins and how they are absorbed. So our fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K, are absorbed with lipids, so they must be dissolved in a lipid droplet or a micelle or packaged into a chylomicron. So they're going to behave in a very similar way as fats in order to be absorbed. They're also going to make their way into our lymphatic circulation as opposed to going immediately into the vasculature. Water-soluble vitamins are going to require special transporter proteins. We know this because they are not able to exist or transport across the lipid bilayer, the cell membrane. So they're going to need a transporter on that membrane to get them into the cell, and then they can be reabsorbed across the basolateral surface via facilitated diffusion mostly. B12 is kind of unique. B12 needs to be bound to a substance called intrinsic factor. I think we spoke about this when we looked at the stomach. Intrinsic factor is secreted by cells of the stomach. And so when we have B12 coming through the stomach, that intrinsic factor is going to hitch on to that B12. It's going to form this complex, and then that is going to be absorbed when it gets to the ileum. So although intrinsic factor is secreted in the stomach, it binds onto that B12, that complex isn't absorbed until we get down into the ileum. Another important reason why, if you have a gastric bypass or anything like that, you must supplement not only your other vitamins and minerals which are absorbed in the duodenum, but B12 specifically, because if you're bypassing most of the intestines, then you lose the opportunity to absorb this complex of intrinsic factor and B12. Sodium. So sodium is absorbed pretty much as a solvent drag with water. We know that water follows sodium and they kind of behave together synchronously. So that's how we absorb most of our sodium along with water. It's actively absorbed in the jejunum, ileum, and mostly throughout the colon as well. So the distal part of the small intestine, and then largely in the colon. Chloride is also following this sodium absorption. Again, usually chloride is kind of following sodium. So water, sodium, chloride, all of those are absorbed as solutes together across from the lumen into the vasculature. Potassium is going to be passively absorbed, and then it will be secreted if the luminal concentrations are low. So if you don't have a lot of potassium coming in, if you don't have potassium present in the lumen of the GI, then you kind of disrupt the gradient that's required for potassium to move passively. Remember, passive movement is going to require or rely heavily upon a gradient. So if you don't have the adequate concentration in the lumen, then the gradient will be reversed and potassium will start moving from the vasculature into the lumen and kind of be wasted in the feces, and that's not what we want at all. So this is another reason why it's important to have adequate potassium coming through in the lumen. Bicarbonate is going to be absorbed and secreted by the jejunum. So after bicarbonate leaves the duodenum, then we really don't need bicarbonate anywhere else. Remember, the function of having bicarbonate being secreted is to neutralize the acidity of the chyme that's coming from the stomach. So we really only need to see bicarbonate in the jejunum right after the duodenum. So it's going to be secreted there to help neutralize any additional acid, but then it's also going to be absorbed there so that we can get rid of it. We don't need it beyond that point. So it is exchanged in distal parts of the ileum and colon where we do not need it. So it's not going to be absorbed later on in the intestine, but it can be exchanged for chloride ions across the lumen as well. So the big picture here, beyond the jejunum, we do not need to be absorbing, we do not need to be secreting bicarbonate. And distal parts in the ileum and colon, we're going to be secreting it. We're going to be secreting it in exchange for chloride ions. Okay. Alrighty. Absorption of minerals. So calcium is actively absorbed in the duodenum and jejunum. It's going to be done by calcium binding protein. So it's going to make its way across the apical surface. And then when it's inside the epithelial cell, it can then be pumped across the basolateral surface by calcium pumps. So kind of similar to some of our other substances, they're going to be passively brought into the cell and then actively pumped across the basolateral surface. Iron, we talked about iron a little bit already in the cardiovascular system. Iron needs to be bound to transferrin in order to be circulated. And so when it binds on, it can be uptaken into our cells via receptor-mediated endocytosis. And all of that means is that this transferrin iron complex can bind onto certain receptors, and once it binds to that receptor, it's going to be endocytosed or engulfed into the cell, and it can be stored if it's needed, or it can be bound to transferrin once again and circulated in the blood, depending on our state, depending on our iron levels and hemoglobin concentration and other things like that. So if it's being stored, it's going to be in the form of ferritin. If it's being circulated, it's going to be in the form of transferrin bound onto that iron. Water is absorbed mostly in the colon. We kind of talked about this. The function of the colon is really to solidify that waste. We secrete quite a bit of water into the lumen of the GI, about 7 liters per day, and that is helping with motility. Remember, we need to lubricate this, this chyme as it's coming through the GI, so we need to be secreting water. And we only intake about 2 liters of water per day. So if we were to secrete 7 liters of water, and if we were not to reabsorb any of that, we would be losing 5 more liters than we are intaking. So we would be at a severe water deficit. That is why water must be reabsorbed, especially in the distal part of the colon. Otherwise, you would lose 7 liters of water per day, which we do not want. So most of that water is reclaimed via osmosis. So again, we set up these solute gradients, which facilitate the movement of water according to its gradient. Okay, and I think that's all we have for today. I want you guys to take a look at these checkpoint questions. And when we meet on Wednesday, we're gonna discuss these. There are also some checkpoint questions in the motility packet. So have a look at those 2 groups of checkpoint questions, and then we'll start off on Wednesday by kind of reviewing that, and then we'll move swiftly into the reproductive system.